and welcome to the Regulatory Matters webinar series, brought to you by the Master of Science in Regulatory Science and the Johns Hopkins University Office of Advanced Academic Programs. Today's event features a discussion on the role of AI and ML in medical product development and regulatory science with Dr. Jonathan Helfgott. My name is Natalie Cross, and I am the event producer. Please note today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Regulatory Matters playlist. During the program, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we will answer as many questions as possible during the latter portion of the event. With that, I will turn over the presentation to our moderator, Dr. William Barrier, Program Director for the Master of Science in Regulatory Science program at Johns Hopkins University.
Okay, hello everyone and good afternoon. I'm Bill Barrier. I am the Program Director for the Business and Regulatory Division that's part of the Advanced Academic Program under the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. I know that's a mouthful, but that's who we are. We offer degrees in regulatory science as well as business, enterprise, and entrepreneurship. And in the future, we'll be having some webinars in that area as well. This is our first webinar series that we will be starting. And as part of this, we have one of our esteemed instructors, Dr. Jonathan Helfgott, who will be presenting today. But what I would tell you to do, if you aren't familiar with our programs, please go out to our websites and see about all the things that we're doing in the regulatory science program, as well as the business and enterprise program. And the way I like to say to everyone is that, you need the regulators in order to get products approved. You need the business people to get things sold in and to make it successful. And of course, we need the scientists to do so as well. So we need all three people, all three groups to make a successful product introduction. So just a couple of things. As we were going through this presentation, one of the things we decided, we weren't sure who the audience was going to be. So we decided to make this a two-part series. And so the next one will be beginning of next year. But we also wanted to do a little bit of level setting in this regard, just to make sure we didn't start too heavy into AI machine learning without putting a little background in first. So certainly as we complete this session one, we would like to hear some comments in terms of content, maybe some things you would like to hear in the future, some things that you thought you were going to hear today but didn't. But recall, we're going to make this a two-part series. And so what you didn't hear today, you will hear the next time around. So with that, I'm not going to be all formal. I'm Bill Barrier. And then I'm just going to introduce you to Jonathan, who will start off by giving you some background on himself. So with that, Jonathan, take it away, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bill. It's a pleasure to kick off our webinar series. And a little bit about my background. I was privileged to work at the FDA for about 10 years, both at the Centers for Devices and Radiological Health, as well as the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, most recently as the Associate Director for Risk Science within the Office of Scientific Investigations. And I've also been in private industry for about 10 years now as well. And of course, part of the Hopkins family in this particular program for almost 15 years, and an alumni of our Bioscience Regulatory Affairs program, as it was originally called, as well. So it's really this trifecta of industry, agency, and academia that I'm going to be approaching this topic today. And so I'm hopeful that my insights will be useful, and most importantly, by the conclusion of this lecture, you will be able to apply this information in a very meaningful way, such that you will understand the rubric of the FDA regulatory requirements, as well as how it applies to those oversights for medical devices in particular, in which AI, ML-based, and software as in a medical device are subcategories, and there's cross-cutting considerations that we look forward to discussing throughout the different product life cycles across various different therapeutic areas and phases of medical product development. So we're going to start at a high level with the foci on FDA, medical devices, and then dive into, very superficially, if you will, the oversight of AI ML based type of products. And with the second part of the series, as Bill had mentioned, we're going to go into some of the more technical aspects of validation, testing, and many of the technical aspects of ensuring that we're maintaining the suitable design controls throughout the life cycle of an AI ML based product, which is different with respect to the dynamics when compared to that of traditional products, even including other types of SA and SIMD. I would like to note we have an entire graduate course dedicated to this very topic. We include actually a digital copy of this book that was published by the Food and Drug Law Institute as well. And a hard copy here, I can always send you a signed version if you sign up for our class and enroll in our program. But just wanted to emphasize we have a whole course catalog that goes into significant detail on all of these topics. And our intent here is to give you a small sample of the rich information that we provide here at our Johns Hopkins University Regulatory Science program. So let's
Jonathan, if I
start.
may, just for a second, thank you. One of the things I would like to add to what you just stated is that, we pride ourselves in really thinking about this in an applied way. So all of our faculty involved are, have experience from, as Jonathan mentioned, like from the FDA, from business, from corporations, you name it, from government, all of those things. So it's just not a bunch of folks, reading from some textbooks and trying to teach you about regulatory affairs of business. These are people with the real life experience. And so that's one of the important parts about our program that we like to make sure people understand. So Jonathan, continue, please.
Thank you. Yes. Um, just going to kick off with an understanding of the agency organizational structure as well as its mission before we proceed into the specifics regarding the laws, the regulatory requirements, and further. Of significant note is as of October 1st, the FDA has gone through a significant reorganization such that what used to be known as, in the red here on the left, the Office of Regulatory Affairs, which was the various different districts that would be across the United States and even internationally, where the offices were held for the field investigators to conduct on-site inspections. That has since been modified, and much of the activity has been integrated into what we see over here into the centers, which I'll talk about in just a second. And this is now known as Office of Inspections and Investigations. So what was formerly ORA is now OII, just as of a month and a half ago. And I should further note that the centers themselves are individually responsible for overseeing and regulating their respective products. And we'll talk about how to differentiate between drugs, devices, and biologics at the legal level, which establishes those standards and those differences. But I wanted the audience to appreciate that the agency itself is driven by the FDA commissioner, which sits within the Department of Health and Human Services in the executive branch of the US government.
Jonathan,
And
I think it's worth noting that the Hopkins is proud to say that one of our own, one of our renowned surgeons, has been nominated to be the FDA commissioner. And so certainly the Hopkins family will give him all the support he needs as he gets into this new role. That's Dr. Marty McCary is his name. He's an oncologist surgeon, has published a number of interesting books, if you will. One of the areas that he does that I'm particularly interested in is his emphasis on underrepresentation in terms of, healthcare and surgery and things of that nature. So we're looking forward to supporting him. We've kind of reached out to him just to say congratulations. So we'll see if we Hopkins can help him in his role, which is a good one, you all guys, So just had to make that plug before we get too far.
Absolutely. And there's frankly a lot of Hopkins alumni that are part of the agency. And there is a formal public-private partnership between FDA and Johns Hopkins University across all of our different programs. And of course, Dr. Barrier is our representative to our Center for Regulatory Science of Excellence, whereby Hopkins actually receives grant money from the agency to promote regulatory science excellence. And so we very much help and love to support the agency's mission in alignment with Hopkins and our program's missions as well. What I would like to share with you in this visual is the framework by which the FDA establishes its jurisdiction and can ultimately take enforcement action. So what you see here, if we start from the bottom and work our way up, and also note a dividing line in the middle, the foundation starts with a law that's passed by Congress. Historically, one of the key pieces of legislation was from 1938, the Food and Drug Cosmetic Act, and subsequent amendments to that impacted the role and oversight of FDA's regulation of drugs and biologics and devices, which we'll talk about. But there's also this inverse relationship, as you can see, between the ability to enforce provisions in the law and regulations versus the flexibility granted to modify those provisions. And we'll talk about what this means from a practical perspective with specific examples in the subsequent slides. But I would like to note in particular that there's also this ascending specificity that you start very generic, of course, when you think about the letter of the law, whereby the verbiage is very high level, and then the regulations themselves, which we'll talk about specifically, are what empower in this case, the FDA. And frankly, this framework applies very similarly to other agencies across the US executive branch. But nonetheless, we're going to focus on the 21 Code of Federal Regulations that the FDA operates under. And the laws themselves allow FDA to promulgate regulatory requirements that will cover the provisions that are outlined in the piece of legislation itself. And remember, there's this ascending specificity such that even though the regs themselves are more specific than the law, they're still what we call non-prescriptive in nature, meaning they don't always tell a company exactly what to do or how to do it, simply their expectation of conformance to quality products and consistency. And we'll talk about that with some of the examples of the particular guidances. And that's why what I wanted to do is divide between the inflexibility but enforceability of the law and regulations, which in many ways are two sides of the same coin, versus this top half of the triangle, which are what we call recommendations from guidance, and at the apex, policies. You may be aware, or perhaps you haven't read an FDA guidance, but this provides additional detail on, let's say, a specific regulatory requirement under 21 CFR. Now, the key distinction between a guidance and a regulation is that it is not required to be adhered to by law, whereas a regulation is an extension of the law itself. So there's this disclaimer in the front of every FDA guidance that's, whether it's draft or finalized, that explicitly states only recommended. And if an alternative approach is suitable, the manufacturer sponsor is able to demonstrate why this alternative approach still achieved the same results. I can tell you from experience, it's almost always easier to follow recommendations in guidance than it is to try to justify an alternative approach, especially when there's direct applicability. The gray areas, of course, are where you're a hybrid, you're a novel technology, and let's say only part of a guidance applies. In those cases, you have to be strategic, whereby you're justifying an alternative approach, yet explaining you're following the recommendations as outlined in a particular guidance. Now, at the very top are the policies that can drive how the agency functions with respect to all these different subsequent categories of final guidance is issued, regulations, and law. So, for example, there is this concept known as enforcement discretion, whereby the FDA can notify the public it is not intending to enforce specific provisions in the regulation. Of note, it still has the discretion to enforce egregious cases. So it's not that they are barred from taking action, it's they're notifying the public their intent, since the FDA is a risk-based agency, to again use a risk-based approach to then, in fulfillment of its protection and public health mission, to then focus on other priorities and in effect neutralize existing regulations that might be on the books, but only under extreme cases will be enforced. So that's why policy in many ways, and of course, as mentioned with the incoming expected new commissioner with a new executive branch in the US government office, there's going to be a shift in different policies. So for example, I was at the agency during the transition between the Bush and Obama administrations, and literally overnight, based off of the priorities, there were policies put in place such that certain final guidances were immediately redacted. And as mentioned, certain enforcement discretion policies were either lifted and or put into place. So hopefully now you've understood the framework by which FDA operates between the laws that are typically responsive, written by Congress in reaction to a public health crisis, the regulations that are promulgated by the agency and subsequent recommendations from guidance that go into the specificity of the provisions, and then policies that could change. So let's give you an example of a piece of legislation. So in 1976, the FDA issued the Medical Device Amendments Act, and they defined a medical device as any product intended to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, or detect disease that does not achieve its primary mechanism of action through chemical action. Interestingly, this is very similar verbiage to that used to also regulate drugs and biologics, but note the distinction. Does not achieve its principal intended purposes through chemical interaction. So typically mechanical actions, obviously automated and software actions, which we'll get to, fall under the medical device category. But the first question to ask is whether a product meets the legal definition of a medical device. Is it intended to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, or detect disease? And if so, and it's not achieving its primary mechanism of action through chemical interaction, then it's going to be regulated as a medical device. And as such, it would have to follow what are called the quality system regulations that are outlined under 21 CFR Part 820. This is the equivalent of the good manufacturing practices, the GMPs, under 21 CFR Part 211 for drugs and biologics. This is what we think of as what it takes to consistently produce high quality product. But there's this special provision under 21 CFR 820.30 known as pre-production design controls, whereby once there's a commitment, even if it's a prototype of a medical device, and even if it's simply used as investigational purposes, but it's in a human, you have to adhere to those pre-production design control purposes, which mean you have to have good version control of your medical product, you have to have good document controls, and things like this. So these are the types of differences and the nuances when you compare and contrast in how you manufacture devices and the FDA regulatory provisions between that and drugs and biologics. Drilling down deeper. Yes.
I have a question here that's come up, and as we know, these regulations cover, everything from food, et cetera, et cetera. But how does this relate? I'm getting a question here. How does that relate to, cosmetics, as an example? There's a number of products that are allegedly, marketed as doing a number of things from growing the hair to reducing wrinkles to everything else. So how does that kind of fall under the medical regulations category?
Absolutely. We will cover shortly, thank you, Dr. Bill, the role of intended use and labeling and driving the particular product categorization and its regulation, including cosmetics and other products as well. So sticking with medical devices here, this is an example just, and I'll get to that in just a second,
Mhm.
is a guidance that goes into very detailed specificity on the expectations for those pre-production design control conformance requirements. What does it mean if you're a software product, if you're a hardware product, if you're a combination product, and you're adhering to these 820.30 provisions? And it's a 40-page document, right? So just to give you an idea, 820.30 is half a page, one provision itself within, the quality system regulations could lead to a 40-page guidance document. And then there's, of course, a policy now that's released by the agency intending to replace, I believe, at the start of this calendar year, the entirety with a grace period of 1 to 2 years of the 21 CFR Part 820 quality system regulations with the ISO 1345 medical device lifecycle requirements. Now, what should be noted, they're very similar in nature and almost identical. And the original basis for the quality systems which were promulgated in 1996 or indeed the ISO 1345 standards. Now, it should be noted, as Bill mentions, all the companies that are commercializing medical products are global in nature. So they're simultaneously needing to adhere not just to the FDA requirements, which even though it represents 50% of the plus of the global healthcare expenditure, there are still other regulatory bodies and quality standards that they need to adhere to. And this is where the importance of harmonization and the role of international standards come into play. So it's really from that perspective that the agency is looking to rely on what's already formally recognized as an FDA final guidance, and now in effect will be elevated as regulation to the ISO 1345 quality system standards. And another example is FDA's policy on telemedicine, whereby it should be noted, FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine or standard of care, meaning companies and sponsors of research need to demonstrate to FDA why their product or why their research and how it still fits within existing frameworks of US medical care delivery. And also, especially when we think about AI ML-based products, they can't be such quantum leaps such that there's no place for it within the healthcare continuum, namely the ability to identify eligibility for coverage, for reimbursement, and the pathways to demonstrate the health economic metrics to justify the costs that are associated with a driving adoption, as well as clinical utility. And so this is an example of where technology itself, for example, if you're using off-label Zoom for a physician to communicate with their patient, Zoom wouldn't be regulated as a medical product. It's only when you're going to be labeled as such, which, as Bill was mentioning, would it drive the particular intended use and the particular type of regulatory category. And so the visual that I want you to be familiar with is a swinging regulatory pendulum that, based off of whatever the priority is, really driven from that top level, who the commissioner is, all the way down to the center levels, into the policies that are the priorities that impact the specific guidances, and therefore the regulations themselves and how they're going to be enforced. This is where science and politics are mixing. And as noted, brainstorming isn't regulated by FDA. It's only once you're dedicated to using your medical device in an actual human, even for the first time, do the design control provisions apply. And the entirety of whether you're a medical device or a drug or biologic is always going to be driven by the type of claims and indications for use that you're looking to label your product as. And everything is driven by a risk to benefit relationship. And let's go back to, yeah.
Jonathan, I'm sorry. this is a good place, I think, based on the comment you made earlier. And it's one of the things that, it's like the wish list, the dream list. And you mentioned it earlier, you talked about harmonization. Oh my goodness. Just the differences between the various countries, the various regulatory agencies, between, EMU, you name it. And so, you don't have to adjust this at the moment, but certainly I would think that once we get into the machine learning and AI, that there must be a lot of concerns among many people regarding harmonizations. What are some of the
Mhm.
protections that are going to be put in place? As we know, AI can really be used very well, and it can also be used in a bad way. So just address that later when you get that opportunity, please.
Absolutely. I think, going back to what we were covering, every company wants to find out what's the quickest path to marketing their products globally to drive as much user uh, adoption as possible. And this, of course, is also going to be balanced by what we call in FDA terms, there's actually a legal provision, otherwise known as the least burdensome approach, which is the minimal amount of information that you need to be able to get an approval. And because you're simultaneously looking to enter many different markets at the same time, how do you balance that? And it goes back to exactly what you said, Bill. It's harmonization. It's being able to get the best bang for your buck by following this global standards that multiple different regulatory agencies will accept, such that even companies that, let's say, get introduced into the markets outside the United States, and we'll talk about this later on in the lecture, they could potentially leverage some of the clinical evidence and data that they're collecting post-market to even get into the US market and obtain an FDA approval. So it's really critical for companies to understand these implications, to take a global approach, understand holistically what needs to be done at the onset, such that they'll be able to achieve their commercial goals as efficiently as possible. Now, I have some props here for perhaps one of my favorite parts of the entire lecture. We're going to talk about how a single product could have multiple different indications for use and fall into multiple different regulatory categories. So, it's a tea bag that we all know. If I were to simply fill it up with hot water and drink it, it would be regulated as a food. Now, one time my kid had pink eye, and I was told by the doctor, actually, if you take a tea bag and you hold it as a compress against their eye, it actually will reduce swelling and irritation. So I actually decided I'm gonna buy from Costco Lipton tea bags, and I'm gonna just repackage them and say for use on treating eye irritation. Same product, but I'm relabeled, repackaged. Well, guess what? Based off of that intended use, I could theoretically be a drug, right? There's no pharmacological agents, but let's just say the claim was, well, the polyphenols in there were what were reducing the irritation. Or theoretically, I could even be a cosmetic, right? If I were talking that, well, put this on your eye to reduce puffiness. Or I could potentially be a device, right? If I were to argue that the primary mechanism of action was physical means in nature, and so it was mechanical working with moisture delivery without any chemical interaction. And then also, I decided, there's some evidence that tea bags could also be used for wound care. So I now release a whole new line of my products that I'm going to label for wound care. Guess what? They have their own category of products and regulations and indications for use. And so you can appreciate how it's not necessarily what the device is composed of. That's a part of it. It's what are the claims? What are the indications you're seeking? And how can you provide evidence to substantiate and justify those claims? So with that, I now want to introduce you to summarizing what we've gone through thus far, the FDA regulatory requirements, namely the medical device amendments, 21 CFR, and there's a 3-tiered risk-based classification of medical devices. If your product is intended to treat, cure, diagnose, prevent, detect disease, and it doesn't achieve its primary mechanism of interaction through chemical interaction, then it's going to be regulated as a medical device. But it doesn't necessarily dictate which class of medical device until you can specify the intended use. And so, for example, the vast majority of medical devices are indeed falling into the lower classification of class 1 or class 2 devices. Class 1 are, and we have examples of this, are things like Band-Aids, canes. Class 2 devices are products that traditionally come through what's known as the 510K process, whereby you're demonstrating substantial equivalence. It's an engineering-based review, whereas at the bottom of the slide, this is the high-risk, life-sustaining, life-supporting devices that often require robust clinical trials and clinical data. Only about 10% of medical devices on the market in the US go through the PMA and the de novo pathway, which we'll talk about in some details. So just to further give you a visual with some specific examples, implantable products like heart valves, neurostimulators, those are of course going to be class 3 PMA type of products. And we're going to group, just for the purposes of this lecture, de novo class 3 PMA products in the same category. And in the middle, you can see again, those typically eligible for the 510K program, like orthopedic devices, and then of course, low risk class 1 devices. There's the abbreviated quality system requirements and the ISO 1345 equivalents that class 1 products need to adhere to. They don't need to require what's called pre-market notification, meaning they are simply have to they have to identify what's called a device description under a classification of 21 CFR. So there's about 2,000 plus medical device categories. So you have to still fit under an existing device description to be eligible for either one of the class 2, 1 or 2 categories. So for class 1, though, it's a self-declaration, and you have to be careful to make sure that, again, you truly meet that definition of that medical device category. If you, and you're subject to annual registration and listing fees. Here's an example of a class 1 device for software as a medical SAMD, simply using to transfer or store or retrieve information, low level risk, doesn't even require 510K or PMA. Whereby you start to creep up to class 2, you have to adhere to the totality of the quality system requirements and the ISO 1345 provisions. And you have to demonstrate what's called substantial equivalence to a predicate device or multiple devices. And that is really a matching exercise. And there's this phenomenon known as predicate creep, whereby there's what's called a grandfathered provision from the May 28, 1976 medical device amendments that allowed products that were on the market at the time to be able to demonstrate. And again, the section under the act was 510K, henceforth the 510K program, to demonstrate substantial equivalence to any of those existing products. But the trick was you can then be able to demonstrate substantial equivalence to the most recent 510K issued. So you see, you're allowed to, let's say, add a bell and whistle, augment, expand your indications for use here or there. And when you compare, let's say, the most recent 510K to the original product that was on the market in 1976, they're oftentimes very, very different. And again, there's a lot of discussion around modifying the 510K program at the time. It's alive and well, and this is the pathway by which the vast majority of medical devices are coming through the market. And it's appealing to a lot of the AI, ML-based and software as a medical-based products because you don't have to run a clinical study, whereby the limitation and downside is you're oftentimes restricted to not going too much past the verbiage within the indications for use of your predicate or predicate devices. So again, there's ways to do combination of primary predicates, secondary predicates, split predicates, and again, shameless plugs. We have entire courses on every single one of these categories that we're talking about. We have an entire program on foods. We have an entire course on cosmetics. We have an entire course on medical device law and regulations. So we're really just, again, giving you some samples here, but we're hoping that we've piqued your interest enough such that you'll have an interest in further learning about the amazing offerings through our program that will allow you to have a much deeper understanding of these very, very critical topics. PAC system is a classic example of a 510(k) that is used really as a hub to integrate a lot of medical devices. I'm pausing here and noting we're moving on to class 3 products, even though technically de novo isn't considered a class 3 product. We're going to group it the same just for purposes of this intro lecture because it oftentimes requires clinical data. And as a note, what you're doing is you're in effect creating a new medical device category because it doesn't exist. So you go through this decision flow whereby if you've determined you're illegally regulated as a medical device and you've determined you're not eligible for any class 1 or class 2 devices, by default, you're either going to have to submit a PMA or you're going to have to create this new category, and you do so through this de novo process. And you establish the special controls as the manufacturer and the sponsor. So for example, oftentimes, if you receive a de novo, having successfully completed a clinical trial, you would identify a successful clinical trial similar in design to the one that you ran as a special control that would be necessitated to be issued a subsequent 510(k) that you would actually demonstrate substantial equivalence to that de novo. Again, I know it's a little technical and confusing, but hopefully you followed me, whereby if you're the first product and you don't fit into any 510(k)s because you're so novel, you're going to be either a de novo or a class 3 PMA. I think that's really, for the purposes of this lecture, what's going to be most appropriate for you to understand, such that if your product is life-sustaining or life-supporting, you're likely going to have to run a clinical study, and you're going to have to go through the PMA de novo pathway. If you compare and contrast to the 510(k), you're running significantly less resources to generate the package and to ultimately receive. Now, again, a 510(k) isn't approval, it's just a clearance, whereby for a PMA, you're actually demonstrating what's called safety and effectiveness with clinical evidence. And that's why you can actually make a claim that your product's been approved by the FDA, whereas for 510(k)s, you're only demonstrating what's called substantial equivalence, and you're simply cleared to the market. And so again, just to show you the visual progression of a medical device, as I talked about, if you're novel, you determine whether there's a predicate that you could use as a 510(k), and if not, you have to determine the risk categorization. And here are some specific examples. And I would also like to note that under 21 CFR 860, the definition of valid scientific evidence to support PMAs and really all medical device reviews is very broad in nature. Specifically, note the use of the term reasonable assurance. And I would like for you to actually look within, this is directly from the 21 CFR 860. I couldn't fit it on a specific slide, and I apologize if the font isn't as large as I'd like it to be. But I wanted you to see that there are many different categories outlined here that FDA will accept. No treatments, placebo control, which we'll talk about in just a second, historical control. And this is much more liberal, if you will, than the very conservative provisions that are found under 21 CFR 312.126, which are the provisions for drugs and biologics, namely that adequate and well-controlled studies, whereby it basically states 2 double-blind randomized controlled trials. And again, I'll talk about what that means in just a second, but I wanted you to see how we start. There's this pyramid of evidence. And of course, it starts at the top, right? Well-controlled investigations. Then we work our way down to partially controlled, to objective trials without matched controls, to documented case histories, to qualified experts, to all the way down even to reports from a patient. Whereas no such acceptable provisions exist under the drug and biologic requirements. So there is a difference. And that's not to say there's a compromise in the level of evidence. It's the risk to benefit relationship is inherently a different quantification. So once you've determined that you're a medical product, a medical device in particular, that needs to run a clinical study to collect evidence to show that your product will work, that'll consistently fulfill its specified requirements, you have many different options. And we're going to start at the top and work our way down. So hopefully you can see this graphic that's hopefully effective, whereby both the receiver and the prescriber are unsure as to what is being provided in the bottle. So there's really three different pieces to think about this. There's the blinding aspect, right? So you can have double blind where both parties are unaware. You can have single blind, and frankly, in many medical device studies, this is you can't help but only use those type of approaches because, like, for example, with surgical techniques, it's impossible for a surgeon to use, let's say, a placebo type of product. They could do a sham procedure, but again, when we think about the similarities and differences between drug and biologic and device studies, there are some unique factors that have to be taken into account, such that you still want to collect the highest level of evidence, but sometimes you're just not able to. So remember, blinding can sometimes be impacted by your constraints. And then there's placebo versus non-placebo controlled. You can have, for example, standard of care arm control. You can compare your product to another existing product, or you can have three arms: placebo, your product, and another product. And then there's, if we move our way down, the randomization. Randomization means there's a schema. For example, is it a 1-to-1, 50% are receiving placebo, 50% are receiving treatment? Or is it a 2-to-1? For every one patient that receives placebo, two patients receive treatment. And this is also going to be implemented in many different ways at the site level, at the study level, because how you're going to assign it in block diagrams and so et cetera. There's a whole science behind randomization itself. As we work our way down, we now talk about some of the statistical implications. So, for example, everything's all about hypothesis testing and p-values. And so you have to pre-specify if you're going to do, let's say, a head-to-head comparison to another product where you're going to have a margin of performance where you could still not necessarily be equal, but what's considered non-inferior. But you have to power that study appropriately. And you have to pre-specify what those endpoints are going to be, contrasting to a superiority study design where you're going to demonstrate superior performance. I've seen cases where companies fail a superiority study endpoint, but try to argue, well, we're still non-inferior because if you look at the evidence, and FDA will typically say you have to go back and rerun the study with a pre-specified non-inferiority endpoint. And similarly, the reverse is true. You can't run a pre-specified non-inferiority study and have excellent results that seem to indicate superior performance and try to get a superior claim approved by FDA. Agency will likewise say, go back, rerun the study, powered to a superiority clinical endpoint, and then we would expand that labeling to allow superiority claims. And of course, as we work our way down, there's exploratory analysis, whereby you're looking open-endedly at information and data that exists. And then, of course, there's the whole schools of thought in statistics between frequentist versus Bayesian, whereby there's the traditionalist approach where we're all familiar with paired t-testing. So there is a consideration that the focus is oftentimes in your traditional frequentist approach on the sampling methodology itself, the consistency of the ability to derive and collect from the sample itself. But it doesn't always tell you, it tells you if there's a difference, but it doesn't always tell you the magnitude of the difference. And this is where there's, again, sometimes of a different approach whereby you can use Bayesian approaches to better determine the orders of magnitude and what are called utilize adaptive designs and with interim analyses and integrate what are called prior information. And so there's this balance of frequentist versus Bayesian that will have to be pre-specified in your study design. And as we think about what's called RWD, RWE for products that are post-market, meaning they've been approved already, you can leverage that information. And oftentimes companies do this if they're repurposing products. They're also using technologies to bring patients to clinical trial sites using technologies and decentralized clinical trial methodologies that the agency has formally endorsed through final guidances. There's epidemiologic studies. There's what are called crossover studies, where a patient could be either their own control. You give them, let's say, treatment for, let's say, a month. Then there's a washout period for another 2 months. Then they receive placebo or vice versa. Or in a device study, let's say for an ophthalmic or a dental filler or a facial filler, they're able to treat one side of their face or one eye or one part of their mouth and compare it to the other. So again, these are just examples of ways to collect FDA grade data. So with a little under 15 minutes left, we've now gotten to the considerations for AI ML-based products, recognizing we've already covered the legal implications and the oversight of medical devices. And we've now come to the conclusion that you're making a medical device that is legally regulated by FDA, and it has AI ML as a component. What does this mean? What are the different implications? Recognizing this is just a teaser for part 2 of the series, whereby we'll go into a little more technical detail, but let's have some fun with understanding that in many ways, ML is a component of AI. And let's be honest, it's an overused term that's way overhyped. And what we hope to do is make it real, help inspire the next generation of leaders that are going to utilize these kinds of solutions at our fingertips to solve the biggest problems in healthcare. And so it really depends first on how are you defining your product before you even jump into AI. So assuming, let's say you're dealing with some imaging or you're helping with prognostic or diagnostic indications or medical triaging, and you've determined that you're going to train your product on an existing data set, and you're going to continuously ensure that it builds on the novel information and the normative database as it populates. More information can be fixed and operate in a flexible way, yet generate consistent results, what I call CPR, that FDA wants to see: consistency, predictability, and reliability, as you can imagine. Each of these terms have very specific implications. And so there's a whole glossary, without, again, going into too much detail, that really goes into excruciating detail on the use of these terminologies. And it's really, really helpful to understand, especially when you may be stuck, when you're looking through some very dense guidances with very technical terms. Sometimes what I find, it's very easy to decode, if you will, plug and play the terms as they're explained in the glossaries, and they can help give you more detail and a better and deeper understanding of exactly what the agency is looking to see when it comes to the expectations on AI ML-based products. And likewise for software as a medical device, where it's a standalone product, right? Or a component or an accessory to a medical device. Oftentimes they're being accompanied with an AI ML-based component. Now,
Jonathan, I have a
yes, of
question for
course.
you here. Can software itself be considered a medical device?
Yeah, that's part of the conundrum, if you will, because we're so used to regulating products that we can feel and we can touch and we can use on our bodies. But now with the advent of wearables, mobile apps, it can track health information It can notify physicians. It's playing a more pivotal role than ever in our day-to-day lives, and indeed can be regulated as a medical device when it's marketed as such. And in fact, many of the apps on the Apple Watch, for example, have 510Ks that you can download on the iStore and on the, and there's Droid-based type of technologies as well. And so they're proliferating. And yes, it's difficult to think about, well, how do you stress test software and develop that same level of assurance the way you would for a piece of hardware, whereby its melting point, its storage capacities, and we're going to get into some of those details in the second half of our lecture series. And I'm glad you asked that, because again, folks sometimes have a hard time grasping the whole idea of software as a medical device being regulated as an intangible product. But even more complicated, adding an AI ML-based layer to that. And this is where that dynamic of, well, if a product and it's labeled and it's shipped out, it's locked, it's frozen, I know what it is. But AI ML-based systems are constantly learning. Perfection is a process. So there's oftentimes negotiations with the agency up front with respect to what types of changes may actually require re-reviews, or how far within functional parameters it can operate. A lot of this comes down to the user variability, especially with imaging, where you can manually adjust the sensitivity and specificity based off of certain physician preferences, their training, etc. And so going back to that CPR concept, FDA is going to want to demonstrate that ultimately you're going to have the same results, even irrespective of the various permutations of the different users across the various extremes of your system operation. And so there is a way, again, upfront to collect the data and be able to communicate with FDA. And this is actually one of the first, if not the first, AI ML-based product that was approved by the FDA through the de novo process. And I'm very proud to have been part of this. And in fact, our alumni, graduate from the program, is in fact one of the heads of their regulatory department. And so this is where it's a triaging tool that's used to help physicians identify patients at higher risk of stroke in an emergency room setting, because there's this concept of a 90-minute window of treatment for stroke patients where the outcomes are exponentially better if you're able to get it in time. And so this was used and deployed, frankly, across many different hospitals, across Hopkins as well, in fact. And again, it came through the de novo process, and clinical evidence needed to be collected to support it because it wasn't eligible with the 510K process. And it was, and ultimately we did need, negotiations did have to take place with the FDA to determine what the functional parameters would be. And there's concepts of algorithm change protocols, right? If you think about the continuum of a product life cycle, right? Design controls and iterations are happening constantly. And so it really comes back to just having good software coding and documentation practices in place, proper training, right? Remember, the three things always have to be working in synchrony: your people, your processes, and your technology. In fact, in many ways, it doesn't matter how good your technical solution is. If you don't have the right people that are trained the right way, and you don't have the right processes in place, it doesn't matter how great the technology is going to be. Now, going back, and I know we're coming up on the top of the hour, and I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions here. There is this concern that as an FDA regulator, you may have on algorithm drift. How do I ensure there's no regression on performance? That just because you're getting more information, how do we know it's set up such that there's going to have quality checks that make sure it's, there's noise reduction, and that only high quality data is entering, such that if parameters are modified based off of, confidence bands and intervals based off of regression analyses, etc., that it's all fully traceable and you have what you need at your fingertips to be able to provide the documentation with full audit trails to explain what happened and why, and to catch the dummy data, to catch and to show how you have this ability to detect anomalies from either once they're being entered, how to remove them, and also more importantly, to prevent them from either getting in the first place through appropriate controls and testing. And it all comes back to what's clinically meaningful, driven by your indications for use. What you're
Jonathan,
going, yes.
with that, as we've discussed, in order to kind of give a background before we got into the deeps of this is probably a good time to just pause.
Sure.
And as we've talked about, what the second part of this may be, and who knows, we even have three parts of this, just given all the interest and given all the significant things. But as I was talking, I was just, I looked at my finger. I have one of these rings that everybody is familiar with, which I'm finding amazing in terms of the technology that's based in there. But with that, I think it's probably a good time because it is approaching the bewitching hour, if you will. And let's just make sure we have some questions. But we would really appreciate it. First of all, your time today. And any questions, please let us know. And as we said, there'll be a part two where we will be getting into much more details, as this is a very complicated area, as many of you recognize.
So folks, yeah, if you can please, I don't know what the mechanism is to submit questions, but would love to have an engaging end to our session here.
Here's a couple of questions. I want to make sure we get those right quick.
Sure.
Limited time. What class is Fitbit, or for that matter, this ring I'm wearing, for that? And we can certainly answer these later as well too. There's another one. What immediate and not so immediate shifts do you see in safety regulations, particularly in the traceability rule with the new administration? Wow, that's a good one. And as AI is increasingly being used to create bioinformatic tools for diagnostic and personal medical devices, what type of product would this fall under, and how would the FDA regulate such AI-driven tools? So we only have a minute. We don't.
Yeah,
And so, well, what can I say? If there are any quick answers to any of those, this shout
yeah.
out.
My hope is that at the end of this lecture, you're actually able to answer that question because you can appreciate it's driven by intended use. And based off that intended use, you will determine if you are legally regulated as a medical device by the FDA. And if there's an existing class 1 or 2 category, you would fall under, or if not, you would have to therefore go through either the de novo or PMA pathway. So depending on whether it's diagnostics, personalized medicine, what particular claims you're looking to make, that will tell you exactly how FDA will regulate your product and the expectations that they're going to have. So again, great question. I'm sorry we're running out of time, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to pick up right where we left off during the next session. And in conclusion, it is my hope that you're going to be able to utilize some of the practical considerations that we've shared during this lecture that include FDA's regulation of medical products overall, including the basis and framework of FDA medical device regulations, in particular, the specific considerations for AI, ML-based and software as in a medical device products, and whether clinical evidence is required. And we can go into some more detail on some of the VV&Ts and interdisciplinary approaches during the next session. And so again, thank you all, and hopeful that you'll be able to also use this information to come up with the next big solution to fill these unmet clinical needs.
So on behalf of the Business and Regulatory Division within the Center for Biotechnology, thank you so much for attending. This webinar has been recorded and will be available at some point in all the places that you look for these things. And so thank you again. And we look forward to seeing you in 2025 for part 2 and maybe even part 3.
Thanks, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.